Step out of the shelter and keep your hands where I can see them now." The words cut through the frozen night air like a blade, sharp and absolute, the kind of voice that had learned long ago that it never needed to ask twice. And the man standing alone at the bus shelter on the corner of Delancey and 4th Hands, buried in the front pocket of a faded gray hoodie, breath rising in small white clouds against the 28-degree wind, turned his head slowly toward the approaching headlights, his expression not frightened, not startled, but something far more unsettling to the officer who had just spoken. Calm, entirely unnervingly calm. But before we know what happened next, at that bus stop on a freezing Tuesday night in November, we need to understand who was standing there. Because the man Officer Brett Hagen saw when his spotlight flooded, that plexiglass shelter was a silhouette in a dark hoodie and a black wool beanie, hands concealed tall and still against the shadows, a figure that fit every assumption a lazy patrolman carries in his chest like a loaded weapon. What Officer Hagen could not see, what no one standing on that empty, ice-slicked street could have known, was that the man in the hoodie had spent that Tuesday dismantling a $40 million money laundering syndicate in front of a federal judge, and that when he was done, FBI agents had gathered their notes and defense attorneys had quietly reconsidered their plea deals. His name was Calvin Reeves, and he was 44 years old, Deputy Chief of the Violent Crimes and Racketeering Division of the United States Attorney's Office, a man who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how power worked and exactly how it could be taken away from people who abused it. The day had been long in the way that only days spent in federal court can be long. 9 hours of cross-examinations and sidebar arguments, and the specific kind of exhaustion that settles not in the muscles, but somewhere behind the eyes, in the place where language lives. Calvin had been building this case against the Alderman Syndicate for 14 months. 14 months of wiretaps and grand jury testimony, and late nights in an office that smelled of old coffee and case files. And today had been the day it all came together, in the way that good prosecutions do not dramatically, not with fireworks, but with the quiet, grinding weight of irrefutable fact. He had been in the underground parking garage of the federal courthouse key, already in the ignition of his Audi A6, when the car gave him nothing but the rapid, desperate clicking of a dead battery, the sound of a machine that has simply had enough. He had sat there for a moment with his forehead resting against the leather steering wheel, the silence of the garage pressing in around him. And then he had made the practical decision that anyone makes when they are tired and their car is dead. He would take the T2 stops and catch the 61 bus the rest of the way home to Brookline. Before leaving the parking garage, he had stripped off the armor of his professional life, the tailored charcoal suit jacket, the silk tie, the French-cuffed dress shirt, and packed them neatly into his leather messenger bag, the bag that also held 3 legal pads covered in dense handwritten notes and the heavy leather wallet that carried his credentials. In their place, he had pulled on the gray Harvard Law hoodie he kept in the bag for late nights, dark sweatpants, and the black wool beanie against the cold, and he had walked up out of the garage and into the November night, looking like exactly what Officer Hagen would later describe in his report, a black man in dark winter clothing wandering a gentrifying neighborhood at night. The corner of Delancey and 4th was the kind of place that happened when money moved into a neighborhood faster than community, did new condominiums, with glass facades, stood next to hardware stores that had been there since the 60s, and the streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving long pools of shadow between islands of orange light. The bus shelter itself was a rectangle of scratched plexiglass and bent metal, the kind of municipal furniture that suggested the city knew this stop existed, but had not thought deeply about the people who used it. Calvin checked his phone. The 61 was running 14 minutes late. He shoved his hands into the front pocket of the hoodie, shifted his weight from one foot to the other to keep warm, and watched his breath dissolve into the darkness above him, thinking about nothing in particular for the first time all day, the way the mind empties itself when it has finally been given permission to rest. He did not hear the police cruiser until its spotlight found him. 3 blocks east, Officer Brett Hagen was parked in the shadow of a closed dry cleaning shop, his cruiser idling with the particular low growl of an engine that has been left running too long, a cup of gas station coffee growing cold in the cup holder beside him. The radio muttered and crackled with the usual overnight chatter noise he had learned over 14 years to filter automatically the way a man learns to sleep through traffic. 14 years. The number sat in his chest like a stone he had stopped noticing because it had been there so long. He had joined the department at 24, straight from a stretch in the Army that had given him a taste for structure and a distrust of anything he couldn't understand quickly. And in those early years, he had believed genuinely, completely. Believed that he was one of the good ones, one of the men who kept the line between order and chaos from dissolving entirely. He had wanted the promotion to detective. He had taken the test twice. He understood in the way that people understand things they cannot bring themselves to say aloud. That the complaint file that followed him through his personnel record, 7 citizen grievances in 14 years, each one stamped, resolved no further action was the reason the promotion never came. He did not think of himself as someone who had done anything wrong. He thought of himself as someone who had done what was necessary in situations that soft people who had never actually stood on a dark street at 2 in the morning and made a decision with incomplete information would never understand. The neighborhoods he patrolled did not forgive hesitation. The people in them were not waiting for him to ask the right questions. He had kept order in places where order did not come naturally, and if some people along the way had found that uncomfortable, he had decided long ago that their comfort was not his responsibility. That Tuesday night, his lieutenant had passed along the area directive during roll call a string of residential burglaries over the past 3 weeks in the blocks around Delancey, the kind of crime pattern that generated pressure from council members and made captains nervous. The suspect description that had gone out over dispatch was the kind of description that Hagen had learned to use like a skeleton key. Male black, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark winter clothing. He had never paused to consider what it meant to issue a description that covered on a cold November night, in a city of hundreds of thousands, a substantial percentage of the men walking any street. He had simply filed it in the place in his mind where actionable information lived. He was not by his own account looking for trouble. He was looking for a reason, and the difference between those two things was something he had stopped examining a long time ago. When he turned the cruiser onto Delancey, and his headlights swept the length of the block, the street was empty in the way that streets get empty on a night. This cold. Nothing moving. Nothing waiting. And then his eyes found the bus shelter, and the figure standing inside it, tall and still in dark clothing. Hands, not visible face, turned slightly away from the road. Something settled into place in Hagen's chest, the particular click of a man whose instincts have been fed for so long on the same diet that they have stopped being instincts and started being appetite. He did not ask himself whether the man at the bus stop was waiting for a bus. He did not notice the bus route sign posted clearly above the shelter. He did not consider that it was a marked public transit stop on a Tuesday night, a completely ordinary location for a completely ordinary person to be standing. Instead, he reached for the controls, without thinking the same way he reached for everything he had decided to do in the 14 seconds it took to slow the cruiser to a stop. His hand finding the spotlight flooding the shelter with light so wide and sudden that it seemed to cut the world in half. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the frozen slush, his right hand settling naturally casually against the grip of his holstered weapon. He had not identified any crime. He had not formulated any articulable suspicion. He had simply looked at a black man standing alone in the dark and decided that this was what the night had been waiting to give him. The spotlight hit Calvin like a physical thing, sudden and total, turning the world behind it into absolute darkness, so that the cruiser became nothing but a source of blinding white, and the low rumble of an engine that had not fully stopped before a door was swinging open. Calvin raised one gloved hand to shield his eyes, not in alarm, but in the reflexive, practical way of a man trying to see what he is dealing with. And what he saw as his vision adjusted around the edges of the beam was a police interceptor, a uniform stepping out of the driver's side, a hand resting with practiced familiarity against a holster. He felt a flicker of something that was not quite annoyance and not quite concern, the low-grade alertness that had lived in some permanent corner of his nervous system. Since the first time at 19, a police car had slowed beside him on a street where he had not done anything wrong. He had been 19. He was now 44. The alertness had not gone anywhere in between. The officer closed the distance with the particular stride of someone who has spent years using the space between themselves and other people as a form of communication, not rushing, but deliberate each step, carrying the message that the ground he was crossing belonged to him. Calvin did not move. He kept his hands' visible palms slightly open the way he had learned to keep them before he knew the legal terminology for why it mattered. When Hagen was close enough that Calvin could see the badge number on his chest, 1147, and he committed it to memory in the same automatic way he committed case numbers and statute citations, the officer stopped and looked at him with an expression that was not hostility exactly, but something that sat just beside it, a preformed judgment, wearing the face of professional neutrality. Calvin responded in a voice that was quiet, careful, and entirely without the tremor that Hagen had almost certainly been expecting a voice that had spent 20 years in federal courtrooms, learning exactly how much could be communicated through tone alone. He told the officer he was waiting for the 61 bus, that it was running late, that his car had broken down downtown. He said it the way he would have stated an opening fact to a jury, simply clearly with no inflection that could be mistaken for defensiveness. Hagen asked for identification. And here is where something shifted in the air between them, subtle as a change in barometric pressure before a storm, because Calvin did not reach into his bag. He looked at the officer steadily and asked politely without aggression, in the measured tone of a man who uses language as a precision instrument, whether the officer could first tell him what reasonable suspicion existed to justify the stop, and whether he was suspected of committing a crime. The question was 5 seconds of silence before Hagen responded. To Calvin, it was a procedural inquiry, the same question he had asked in dozens of suppression hearings, the foundational question of every Fourth Amendment challenge he had ever filed. To Hagen, standing on a cold street at night, with a man who was not flinching, not apologizing, not performing the particular social transaction that Hagen's experience told him was the only acceptable response to a badge to Hagen, it was something else entirely. It was the specific, deep insult of not being obeyed. Inside the convenience store across the street, Tommy Briggs, 19 years old, and halfway through restocking a shelf of energy drinks, turned toward the window because something in the quality of the light outside had changed. He stood there without putting down the cans in his hands, watching without knowing yet that he was watching. On the 61 bus just then, rounding the corner 2 blocks east, Denise Okafor, a 34-year-old emergency room nurse finishing a 12-hour night shift, looked up from her phone toward the lit shelter at the stop ahead and saw the spotlight and the cruiser and the 2 figures standing in the white glare, and her hand tightened slightly around her phone without her consciously deciding that it should. Calvin asked again evenly, "Am I free to go?" Hagen's jaw tightened, and the answer that came back was not an answer at all. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. What came before, it was visible. If you knew how to read the body of a man who has stopped reasoning and started reacting the way Hagen's weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet, the way his breathing changed from the slow, involuntary rhythm of someone in control to the quicker, shallower pattern of someone preparing to act the way his eyes stopped reading Calvin as a person and started reading him as a problem that needed to be resolved physically because no other resolution was presenting itself. The veins at his temples became more visible. His fingers opened and closed once at his side. He took a half step that was not quite a lunge and was not quite a step. The body moving before the mind had finished deciding the accumulated reflex of 14 years of unchallenged authority, making the decision that the reasoning mind had been too slow to stop. He grabbed Calvin's upper arm with a grip that was designed to communicate a specific message. This is over. I have decided it is over. Your words mean nothing here. And the impact of it, the sudden jolt of being physically seized without warning on a public street, sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Calvin's chest, so sharp it was almost electrical. He did not fight it. He had made that decision before Hagen's hand ever touched him in the same calm corner of his mind that had been cataloging Hagen's badge number and the exact phrasing of every word the officer had said since stepping out of the cruiser. He had made the decision because he understood the statistics with the specific cold clarity of someone who had prosecuted enough cases to know exactly what streets like this one could become in seconds. And because he had also understood in those same seconds that the arena in which he was going to dismantle Officer Brett Hagen was not this street. Hagen spun him, one hand on his arm and one on his shoulder, and Calvin went with the motion without resistance, his body finding the plexiglass wall of the bus shelter before he fully understood it was coming, the impact hitting his left cheek and shoulder, simultaneously knocking the breath out of him, the cold of the glass radiating through his face. "Stop resisting," Hagen said loudly, clearly for the camera on his chest that had been blinking red since he stepped out of the car, and then, 30 seconds later, was not blinking at all. "I am not resisting," Calvin said, loudly and clearly, for the same reason his voice steadied despite the fact that his cheek was pressed against freezing plexiglass, and his shoulder was sending a dull throb down the length of his arm. He went completely limp, offering nothing. No tension, no pulling away, nothing that could be described in any honest report as resistance. Hagen wrenched Calvin's arms behind his back, and the handcuffs came out with the practiced speed of someone who had put them on many people in many situations, and they clicked shut with a sound that was smaller and more ordinary than Calvin had expected, a small mechanical sound for something that was, in fact, a significant event. In the convenience store across the street, Tommy Briggs had put down the energy drinks. He was standing at the glass now, both hands flat against it, watching with the expression of someone who cannot look away from something they know is wrong and cannot yet identify what they are supposed to do about that knowledge. On the 61 bus, which had pulled to the stop and opened its doors to find no one boarding, because the only person at the shelter was currently handcuffed against its wall. Denise Okafor pressed record on her phone without entirely realizing she had done it, her hands acting on something faster than conscious thought, and she held the phone steady even as the bus's pneumatic doors hissed shut, and the vehicle began to pull away from the curb, carrying her and her shaking hands and her recording down the street into the dark. The back seat of a police interceptor is designed, whether intentionally or not, to be a specific kind of unpleasant, hard-molded plastic that offers no comfort and no grip, so that every turn of the wheel sends the person handcuffed inside it, sliding sideways, the cuffs pulling taut against the wrists, with each movement a constant low-grade reminder of powerlessness that is not quite painful enough to protest and not quite comfortable enough to ignore. The car smelled of old sweat and disinfectant spray, and something else underneath both of those that Calvin could not name and did not want to spend time trying to identify. Hagen drove with the particular aggression of someone who has won an argument and is still angry about having needed to win it, taking the turns a degree too sharp, the brakes applied with slightly more force than necessary. The kind of driving that communicates everything it needs to without a word being spoken. Calvin braced himself as best he could with his hands behind his back, and did not complain, because complaining was not the tool he was building with. He was building something else entirely. With his eyes half closed and his body absorbing the motion of the car, Calvin's mind had entered the particular state it achieved in the early stages of a new case, a state of cold, precise organization in which everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes was being sorted and cataloged and assigned to its correct position in a structure that was already taking the shape of a federal complaint. He ran through the timeline with the same methodical attention he would have given to reviewing discovery materials the exact time the spotlight hit him, the street names visible through the plexiglass at the moment of impact, the precise wording of every statement Hagen had made. The badge, number 1147. The moment he was almost certain of the moment when the red light on the body camera had stopped blinking. Hagen glanced at him in the rearview mirror at some point during the ride, and whatever he had been expecting to see, fear or fury or the defeated vacancy of a man who has stopped believing in his own outcome, what he saw instead was Calvin looking back at him with an expression of such absolute unconcerned stillness that it unsettled him in a way he could not have explained and would not have admitted. Calvin spoke once in the last 2 minutes, before the precinct came into view. His voice quiet and entirely conversational, the way a man might comment on the weather or the traffic. He said, "You should have asked me what was in the bag." Hagen did not respond, but his hands, Calvin noticed, tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The 14th District Precinct at 11:30 on a Tuesday night had the specific worn-down energy of a place that has seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of its phones ringing at the front desk with the persistence of things that know they will eventually be answered. The flat white hum of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely unwell, the smell of burnt coffee and damp wool coats, and something chemical underneath it all that no amount of cleaning ever entirely addressed. Sergeant Dale Kowalski had worked this desk for 11 years, and he had developed over the course of those 11 years the particular talent of the long-serving bureaucrat, the ability to process human beings efficiently and without much emotional engagement, the way a postal worker processes packages, noting the relevant details, applying the correct stamps, moving on to the next one. He looked up when Hagen came through the door, with Calvin took in the standard picture officer subject, in cuffs, probably a prowler, or a possession charge given the neighborhood, and the time, and reached for his keyboard with the automatic gesture of a man who has already begun typing the report before he has heard a word of it. Hagen talked, and Kowalski half listened, entering the relevant fields possible for 5-9, suspect failure to identify resisting. Standard language, the kind of report that wrote itself. Empty his pockets, Kowalski said, not looking up. The keys came out, a pack of gum, the cell phone nicer than a burglar usually carried, but people stole phones. That was practically its own category of crime now. Then, Hagen lifted the leather messenger bag from Calvin's shoulder and upended it onto the counter, the way you might empty a garbage bag without particular care for what came out of it. The charcoal suit jacket landed first, folded neatly, despite everything expensive fabric bunching against the laminate surface. Then the silk tie. Then the legal pads dense with handwriting in a small, precise hand. Then the wallet, thick leather, dark brown with a small brass snap at the top. That was not the kind of closure you found on a wallet bought at a gas station. Kowalski reached for it, last popping the brass snap with his thumb, flipping it open to find the driver's license so he could log his John Doe properly. He did not find a driver's license. What lay under the snap was a badge, heavy gold, deeply engraved, an eagle spreading its wings above a shield. And above the shield, the words that Kowalski read twice because his brain refused to process them correctly the first time. Department of Justice. His hand stopped moving. He turned the wallet over, opened the opposite panel, found the identification card behind its clear plastic window, a photograph, a serious face, a suit and tie. The same man currently standing handcuffed on the other side of his booking desk, and below the photograph in clean black letters on a white background, the words that made the blood drain out of Kowalski's face so completely that Sergeant Phil Artery, standing 3 feet away sorting paperwork, looked up because something in his colleague's stillness had triggered some alarm below the level of conscious thought. United States Department of Justice, Calvin Reeves, Deputy Chief Violent Crimes and Racketeering Division. Kowalski stood there holding the wallet for 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. The fluorescent lights buzzing above him, the phone still ringing the rest of the precinct, continuing its ordinary Tuesday night business, completely unaware that something had just changed in the room. Artery leaned over, read what Kowalski was holding, and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Kowalski turned toward the break room doorway and called Hagen's name in a voice that was carefully, deliberately ordinary, and it was the very ordinariness of it, the absence of alarm, the flatness that brought Hagen out with his fresh coffee and his expression of mild annoyance, and Kowalski simply pointed at the wallet on the counter, and Hagen looked down, and the coffee mug left his hand before he had made any conscious decision to release it. It hit the floor and broke into 4 pieces, and the sound of it was the only sound in the room. Captain Frank Donahue had a particular relationship with his phone. At 1 in the morning, he answered it because 27 years on the job had conditioned him to answer it. But he answered it with the resigned wariness of a man who has learned that calls at this hour are never about anything good, only about varying degrees of bad. Kowalski's voice on the other end was controlled in the specific way that people control their voices when they are trying not to communicate the full extent of what they are feeling, and the controlled quality of it woke Donahue up faster than the words themselves did. He was in the car and on the highway within 6 minutes. The drive was 12 minutes, and he spent them in a state that was somewhere between thought and paralysis, running through what Kowalski had told him, trying to find an angle from which it looked different, a version of events in which the man in Hagen's cuffs in holding cell 3 was not who his credentials said he was. Some explanation that did not end with the words "Federal Civil Rights Complaint" appearing in his personnel file 2 years before his pension vested. He found no such angle. The precinct felt different when he pushed through the doors, the way a building feels different when something has happened inside it that has not yet been announced. The same furniture, the same lighting, the same institutional smell. But something in the atmosphere pulled tight like a room full of people who have all just heard the same piece of bad news and are waiting to see who speaks first. Hagen was sitting on a metal folding chair in the corner near the booking desk, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the floor, and Donahue looked at him for a long moment, without saying anything, because looking at him was the most efficient way to confirm everything Kowalski had said on the phone. A man who had made an honest mistake in good faith did not sit like that. A man who understood exactly what he had done sat exactly like that. Donahue picked up the wallet from the counter, opened it, read the credentials the same way Kowalski had read them slowly, twice the way you read something when your mind keeps trying to find a different meaning than the one that is plainly there. He set it down, and when he spoke to Hagen, he did not raise his voice, because raising his voice would have been a luxury, and this was not a moment that permitted luxuries. He told Hagen quietly, and with the careful precision of a man choosing words that could not be misunderstood, that the man sitting and holding cell 3 had spent 2 decades prosecuting police officers. Not disciplining them, not investigating them, prosecuting them in federal court in front of juries, with the full weight of the United States government behind every word he spoke, and that Hagen had put handcuffs on him and shoved his face into a plexiglass wall and put him in the back of a cruiser and called it a lawful arrest. Hagen opened his mouth. Donahue held up a hand, and Hagen closed it. Donahue picked up the keyring from Kowalski's desk, felt the cold weight of it in his palm, and walked down the hallway toward holding cell 3, the way a man walks toward something he cannot avoid and has stopped pretending he can. The cell was 8 feet by 6, painted the particular shade of institutional green that appears in prisons and hospital supply rooms and the waiting areas of government buildings, a color that communicates without words that the people inside it are expected to wait and not to expect anything in particular while they do it. Calvin was sitting on the metal bench with his back against the wall and his hands resting open on his knees, the way a man sits when he has decided that the best use of the time available to him is stillness. His eyes were closed, but not in the way of sleep, in the way of concentration, the internal architecture of a mind, doing careful work. He heard the footsteps in the hallway before he heard the key in the lock, and he opened his eyes and looked at the door without moving anything else. The lock turned. The door swung outward with the drawn-out groan of old hinges that had been compressed too long, and Captain Frank Donahue appeared in the opening, keys in hand, a man who was visibly trying to construct an expression appropriate to the situation, and finding that no such expression existed. He began to speak. The word misunderstanding appeared early in the sentence, as it tends to do when institutions are trying to describe things that were not misunderstandings, and Calvin let him finish sitting exactly where he was, making no move toward the open door. Then Calvin asked in the unhurried tone of a man who has all night and knows it, what legal authority had been used to detain him, transport him across the city in handcuffs, and hold him in a cage without charge, and what the precise probable cause had been for each of those actions, and whether the arresting officer had made any effort to articulate a specific criminal suspicion before initiating physical contact. Donahue answered as honestly as he could, which was to say that he essentially confirmed that no such legal authority had existed, and that no such probable cause had been established, and that the arresting officer had not followed the procedural requirements that might have made any of this defensible. Calvin stood up. He stood slowly with the deliberateness of a man who has chosen each movement, and stepped out of the cell into the hallway, and in the light of the overhead bulb, the marks on his wrists were visible, the red indentations where the cuffs had been too tight, a ring around each wrist like a brand, and the bruise on his left cheekbone had darkened to something that would last for days. At the booking counter, he went through his belongings with the same methodical attention he gave to reviewing case documents, signing the property receipt, folding it carefully, and placing it in his jacket pocket. He shook the suit jacket out and put it on over the hoodie, straightened the collar, settled the lapels. The transformation was not theatrical. He was not performing anything, but it was complete in a way that made 2 of the officers watching from the far end of the room find reasons to look somewhere else. He turned and found Hagen with his eyes, and held them for a moment that lasted exactly long enough. He said, "Get a very good lawyer." Then he walked to the front door and pushed it open, and went out into the November dark, and Phil Artery, watching from the hallway, turned to Kowalski and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. He was at Gerald Whitmore's door at 8 o'clock the next morning, and the first thing Whitmore said when he looked up from his desk was not good morning. It was, "What happened to your face?" The bruise on Calvin's cheek had settled overnight into a color that was difficult to look at without registering its cause, the kind of mark that told its own story before the person wearing it had said a word. Calvin sat down across from Whitmore's mahogany desk and told the story anyway. Not with the anger the situation might have justified, but with the same dispassionate, sequential precision he used to present evidence to a grand jury, moving through the events of the previous night in chronological order, not editorializing, not emphasizing, simply building the record. By the time he was finished, the coffee in Whitmore's cup had gone cold and untouched, and the older man's face had moved through several expressions before settling on the particular one that senior officials wear when they understand the full dimensions of a disaster. Whitmore reached for the phone. Calvin said, "Don't." He explained it the way he would have explained a prosecutorial strategy to a junior attorney, patiently, with the reasoning made visible if Whitmore made calls. If pressure was applied from the top of the federal food chain down to the city's police department. What would happen was a quiet firing, a carefully worded press release, a check written to make the problem go away in a way that protected everyone involved and changed nothing. The department would learn that it had made a mistake of selection, that it had picked the wrong person to do this to, rather than learning that it had built and maintained and protected a machine that did this to people who lacked the credentials to fight back. And the next cold Tuesday night, another man in a hoodie would find himself staring into a spotlight. Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Calvin asked for a formal leave of absence to avoid any conflict of interest effective immediately. He wanted no resources of the U.S. Attorney's Office involved in what he was about to do. He would be retaining private counsel and proceeding as a private citizen. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then, as Calvin was standing to leave, he said something that was not part of any official record. Said it quietly toward the window rather than toward Calvin. He said, "The Fourth Amendment doesn't have a footnote that says it only applies when it's convenient." Calvin picked up his bag and left without responding because the statement was correct and complete and did not require his endorsement. The offices of Raymond Coles occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower that looked out over the harbor, and everything about them, the quality of the furniture, the silence between rooms, the way the administrative staff moved with the unhurried confidence of people who work for someone who has never lost a case, he decided to take communicated that this was a place where the law was not practiced but wielded. Coles himself was 58, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of physical stillness that distinguished people who have learned to conserve every resource for the moment it matters. He had extracted more money from corrupt municipalities than most people would ever see in a lifetime, not because he was motivated by the money, though he appreciated it, but because he understood that the only language institutional power reliably understood was the language of financial consequence. He listened to Calvin with his hands folded on the desk and no expression on his face that Calvin could read, and when Calvin finished, Coles did not ask the question that most people asked first. He did not ask how much Calvin wanted. He asked, "What do you need to happen?" Calvin laid it out with the same clarity he would have brought to a charging decision. The settlement could not be private, could not include a non-disclosure agreement, and could not allow any of the principals to escape with their pensions and their reputations quietly intact. The pattern of buried complaints had to be exposed. The institution had to pay a price that was connected visibly and publicly to the specific behaviors that had produced it, not as an abstraction, but as a number large enough and terms specific enough that no police captain in the city could read about it and fail to understand what it meant for their department. The number Calvin had in mind was $4.7 million. Coles looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else. He picked up his phone and told his assistant to send a preservation letter to the MBTA immediately, specifically to the maintenance records and security footage archive for the Bus 61 route, the camera system on the forward-facing unit. The footage from the previous Tuesday evening between 7:40 and 8 o'clock, to be held under legal hold pending litigation. He said it in the tone of someone ordering a cup of coffee, someone for whom the activation of the full machinery of civil rights law was simply the first item on the morning's agenda. He then looked back at Calvin and said, "They forgot about the bus." Calvin said, "I know." Denise Okafor had watched the video 4 times before her shift ended. Sitting in the break room of the emergency department at 6 in the morning with a cup of tea going cold beside her, the footage playing on her phone screen in the particular silence of a hospital at the hour when the night staff are winding down and the day staff have not yet arrived. She was not by disposition an activist or a person who sought public attention. She was a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and called her mother on Sundays and kept her personal life personal. And the video on her phone was 11 seconds of shaky footage that she had taken without entirely deciding to the result of a reflex rather than a plan. But she had been on that bus. She had been 6 feet from the window when the driver pulled to the stop and found no one waiting because the only person at the stop was pinned against the shelter wall by a man in a uniform. She had seen the stillness of Calvin's body, the absolute, deliberate, made-from-decision stillness of a person who was not resisting and was making sure every cell in his body communicated that fact. She had seen the unnecessary force. She had seen the cuffs go on. She had kept the footage because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She had not posted it. She had not sent it anywhere. On Wednesday morning, a message came through a mutual contact. Would she be willing to speak with Mr. Coles's office? The question was put to her gently, without pressure, and she sat with it for a full day before she called back and said yes. Meanwhile, Tommy Briggs had not been able to stop thinking about what he had written on Facebook at midnight after his shift, a simple, factual account of what he had seen through the convenience store window. No hashtags, no commentary, just the sequence of events as he had observed them. He had written it because he was 19, and still at the age where the distance between seeing something wrong and saying something about it had not yet been filled in by the 1,000 small compromises that accumulate over a lifetime. By the time he woke up Wednesday afternoon, it had been shared 40,000 times. When a representative from the city's legal team called his manager's store line Thursday morning and left a message suggesting that his account was based on an incomplete view of events and that he might want to reconsider the characterization, Tommy looked at the message for a long time. Then he called the number Coles's office had sent him through a mutual friend and said he would testify to exactly what he had written under oath whenever they needed him to. The press conference happened on the front steps of the federal courthouse on a gray Thursday morning, and Raymond Coles stood at the podium with the practiced ease of a man who has done this many times and understands that press conferences, like trials, are won in the preparation rather than the performance. He played the video on a large screen behind the podium. 11 seconds. No audio needed. Calvin standing still and unthreatening hands visible. Hagen lunging. The impact against the glass. The cuffs. And in the last 3 seconds of footage visible because the bus had stopped at the shelter and the interior light was angled precisely right, the moment Hagen turned his body slightly away from Calvin and his hand moved to the camera on his chest and the red light stopped blinking. The assembled press corps was silent for 3 seconds after the video ended. Then every question was asked at once. The conference room in Raymond Coles's office was designed for exactly this kind of work. Long mahogany table, high-backed chairs, natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows, a court reporter seated at the head with her stenotype machine in front of her, a setup that was comfortable enough to put people at ease, and formal enough to remind them that every word they spoke was being permanently recorded. Brett Hagen sat on one side of the table in a gray suit that had probably fit him when he bought it, and no longer did the jacket pulling slightly at the shoulders, the collar of his dress shirt gapping at the button. He looked, Calvin thought, like a man who had aged 5 years in 4 months, which was approximately the effect that being placed on unpaid administrative leave and stripped of your badge and weapon tended to have on a person who had organized his entire identity around both of those things. Calvin sat across from him with his hands folded on the table, watching the way he had watched witnesses in federal court for 20 years, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with the particular focused attention of someone cataloging everything for later use. The city's attorney, a careful man named Weston Pryor, who had spent his career cleaning up after other people's decisions, sat beside Hagen with a legal pad and the expression of a man who has already read the discovery materials and understands that his position today is not to win, but to limit the damage to something manageable. Coles opened a plain manila folder and looked at Hagen pleasantly. First layer. He walked Hagen through the justification for the stop, the burglary suspect, the description, the match. Hagen answered with the careful pre-coached language of a man who has been told exactly what to say. Reasonable suspicion, matching description, standard investigatory stop. He said it with reasonable confidence, the confidence of someone repeating a prepared text. Coles reached into his briefcase and produced a document bound in blue legal backing, slid it across the table to Pryor, and opened his copy. He read from the certified dispatch log for the 14th District Tuesday evening timestamp, 1942 in at 14. Baker had apprehended the burglary suspect on a street 2 miles from Delancey and 4th, a 19-year-old male in a red jacket and jeans, taken into custody at 7:42 p.m. The bolo had been cleared on the primary tactical channel at 7:43 p.m. 8 minutes before Hagen's spotlight found Calvin at the bus stop. Coles then read from the same log timestamp, 1945, a routine status check. Same channel, Hagen acknowledging receipt. He had his radio tuned to that channel. He had responded to a communication on that channel 3 minutes after the bolo was canceled. He had known the suspect was already in custody before he ever stepped out of his car. Pryor did not object. He wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it twice. Second layer. The body camera. Hagen held to his prepared answer. Malfunction, cold weather technology fails. Coles produced a second document. The metadata audit from the camera manufacturer pulled via subpoena, time-stamped to the second. At 7:48 p.m. and 12 seconds, the power button on Hagen's Axon unit had been manually depressed and held for 3 seconds until the unit powered down. The camera had not malfunctioned. It had not experienced a battery failure. It had experienced a deliberate manual shutdown, performed 30 seconds before Hagen stepped out of his cruiser. Hagen's eyes went to Pryor. Pryor was looking at the table. The word that applied to what Hagen had done, destroying evidence before using force on a citizen who had done nothing wrong, was not a word that appeared in any employment handbook as a disciplinary category. It was a federal criminal statute. Third layer, the report. Coles read Hagen's own language back to him. Subject displayed physical resistance and failure to comply. Then he hit play on the laptop at the corner of the table, and the bus footage, the high-definition forward camera angle, perfect lighting, adequate, played without sound. Calvin motionless, arms loose. No tension in the shoulders, no physical response to Hagen's approach, beyond a slight backward lean that physics, not aggression, had produced. Hagen's lunge. The impact against the glass, the cuffs going on a man who was offering in every possible way a body can communicate it, complete non-resistance. Coles asked, "Is that physical resistance?" Officer Hagenhagen said nothing for a long moment, and then said he would need to review the footage again. The floor. Coles set down the folder and produced a different document, not evidence, but history. 14 years of service, 7 citizen complaints. Each one described briefly, each one stamped, resolved no further action. He read each complainant's name aloud, slowly giving each one the 4 seconds of space in the record that they had been denied when the complaints were filed. Names of people who had gone to the precinct and filled out forms and been told that the matter had been reviewed and then heard nothing else. He did not ask Hagen any questions about them. He simply read the names and let the silence between each one do the work. Calvin moved for the first time in 90 minutes, a small thing barely visible. He shifted slightly in his chair, a recalibration of posture, and then he was still again. Coles closed the folder. "Mr. Pryor," he said, with the measured courtesy of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be understood, "I suggest a brief recess. You and your client have a great deal to discuss. They came from different places and for different reasons, and none of them would have described themselves as brave, which was perhaps the most honest thing about all three of them. Denise Okafor arrived at the deposition in her street-clothes jeans, a dark jacket, her hospital ID, still clipped to the lapel from the shift she had come from, and she sat down in the witness chair with the posture of someone who is slightly uncomfortable with the situation, but has decided that discomfort is not a reason not to be there. She had met Calvin once in the weeks before a brief meeting in Coles's conference room that had lasted less than 10 minutes. Calvin had asked her a single question. Had she been able to see clearly? She had said yes. He had thanked her and stood up. And that had been the whole of it. What she described under questioning was not dramatic. It was simply precise. She had been a passenger on Bus 61. She had looked out the window as the bus stopped. She had seen a man in a hoodie standing at the shelter and a police officer in full uniform. She described what she had seen in the flat, careful language of someone who gives medical reports for a living. Someone who has learned that accuracy is more useful than emphasis. The man at the shelter had not moved aggressively. He had not raised his hands or his voice. When the officer had initiated physical contact, the man had gone still, not stiff, not resistant. Still the way someone goes still when they have made a deliberate decision to offer no pretext for escalation. "I've worked emergency medicine for 11 years, she said, when the city's attorney pressed her on whether she could truly determine intent from a bus window. I know the difference between a person who is struggling and a person who is standing there." Afterward, in the hallway outside the deposition room, she stood alone for a few minutes before taking the elevator down. She was not sure what she felt. She had told the truth, which was the only thing she had been asked to do, and it had not required courage, so much as the simple refusal to pretend she had not seen what she had seen. Tommy Briggs had almost not come, not because he was afraid, or not only because of that, but because he was 19, and the city's legal team had called his manager's store line twice in the same week, and the second call had been less gentle than the first. And there was a specific discomfort in being 19 and having people with titles and briefcases suggest in very careful language that your memory of events might be less reliable than you thought. He had called his older sister, who was a paralegal in a different city, and she had told him that what was being done to him was called intimidation, and that he should talk to Coles's office, which he did, and they sent someone to meet him at the store on his lunch break, and the person they sent did not ask him to say anything other than what he had seen. What he had seen was simple. He described it simply. A man at a bus stop who was not doing anything, an officer who arrived and then very quickly stopped talking and started pushing. A physical altercation that had one party moving and one party entirely still. "I work retail," Tommy said in the room with a steadiness that surprised the people in it, including himself. "I know when somebody's causing trouble and when somebody isn't." He wasn't. Phil Artery requested the meeting through a channel that bypassed the department, entirely called Coles's office directly from a personal cell phone on a Sunday morning, and arrived with a USB drive that he set on the table before he sat down. It contained scanned copies of 7 complaint forms, each one time-stamped, each one bearing Hagen's name, each one marked in the system as resolved, with no supporting documentation attached to indicate what resolution had looked like or whether any review had taken place. Artery was 50-20 years on the force, the kind of man who had spent 2 decades telling himself that the individual decisions he made were small and that the institution he served was larger than its worst moments. He did not say any of that in the room. He said only, "I signed off on 2 of these. I shouldn't have. I'm not going to pretend I didn't." He left the USB drive on the table and went home. The mediation room on the 32nd floor of a downtown arbitration center looked out over the harbor through floor-to-ceiling glass, and on the morning of the session, the water was the flat pewter gray of late winter, The kind of sky that gives nothing back and promises nothing, and the light it cast into the room was the same, neutral even without warmth. Mayor Arnold Pruitt arrived first with his city attorney and the police chief, and the three of them arranged themselves on one side of the long conference table, with the careful deliberateness of people who have discussed in advance exactly where to sit and what it communicates. Pruitt was 60, silver-haired, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one, rooms where problems were converted into agreements, and agreements were converted into press releases, and press releases were converted into the past. Calvin arrived with Raymond Coles, and they sat on the other side of the table, and Calvin placed nothing in front of him. No legal pad, no documents, no folder, because everything he intended to say he had already committed to memory, and everything he had committed to memory he intended to say exactly once. Pruitt opened with the warmth and gravity appropriate to an occasion at which the city was acknowledging that something had gone badly wrong, and he said the word misunderstanding twice, and the word regret once, and the phrase opportunity for healing once, and he moved with the efficiency of long practice to the offer $1.5 million payment to be made in full within 60 days, with a mutual non-disclosure agreement, preventing either party from discussing the terms of the settlement publicly. He folded his hands and looked at Calvin with the expression of a man who considers himself to be offering something substantial. Calvin allowed a moment of silence that lasted precisely long enough. Then he placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it without ceremony to the center. "These are my terms," he said. "There won't be a second draft." The first term was the number $4.7 million, calculated not as a punitive abstraction, but as a direct representation of the cost to the city of maintaining a patrol division that had processed, filed, and buried 7 citizen complaints against a single officer over 14 years. Rather than addressing them, the compounded cost of every unnecessary arrest, every potential civil liability that had not yet been litigated, every hour of legal exposure that had been deferred rather than resolved. The second term was the disposition of Brett Hagan, termination for cause, publicly stated, with forfeiture of pension, not a resignation, not a mutual separation, not an agreement that allowed him to leave quietly on his own terms. The record would reflect what the record should reflect. The third term was the retirement of Captain Donahue and Sergeant Kowalski, formalized as early separations due to supervisory failure and falsification of public records. Not promotions, not commendations, not the standard arrangement by which people responsible for institutional failures were eased out with their honor intact. The fourth term was the one that caused Pruitt to set down his pen and look directly at Calvin for the first time since the meeting began. There would be no non-disclosure agreement. The terms of the settlement would be released in full to the public without redaction within 48 hours of signing. If any of the preceding terms were refused, Calvin would forward the complete discovery file. The dispatch logs, the camera metadata, Artery's USB, drive the deposition transcripts to the Civil Rights Division of the FBI, with a formal request to open a pattern and practice investigation into the 14th District. An investigation that, if opened, would place the department under federal oversight for a minimum of 10 years and strip the city of its operational autonomy over its own police force. The room was quiet for a long time. The police chief looked at the table. The city attorney looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the sheet of paper in front of him, and then he looked at Calvin. And Calvin looked back at him with an expression that communicated without words that the silence could last as long as the mayor needed it to, and that the terms would not change when it ended. Pruitt picked up the pen, held it for a moment. Signed. Calvin stood, took the signed document, and nodded once, not in triumph, just in acknowledgement, and walked with Coles toward the door. In the elevator going down, Coles looked at him and asked if he felt like he had won. Calvin thought about it for a full floor before he answered. "I feel like something got corrected," he said. "That's different." On a Thursday afternoon that was otherwise unremarkable, Brett Hagen drove to the 14th District Precinct and collected the contents of his locker in a cardboard box. The termination letter was in his jacket pocket, folded the crease already softened from the number of times he had taken it out, and read it since it arrived. He walked through the parking lot to his car, put the box in the trunk, and stood beside the car for a moment in the thin winter light, not going anywhere. Not doing anything, just standing there with his hand on the trunk lid. Above him, the sky was the same cold gray it had been for weeks. He finally got in the car and drove away. And no one who was there that afternoon could have said exactly when he left. Denise Okafor walked past the corner of Delancey and 4th on her way to a Tuesday night shift. 2 months later, her coat pulled close against the cold, her bag over her shoulder. She glanced at the bus shelter. As she passed, the plexiglass scratched and slightly clouded the bench inside unoccupied, and kept walking, and the 61 bus went by in the other direction, its windows lit from within, carrying people home. 6 months after a dead car battery changed the direction of everything, Calvin Reeves walked into the federal courthouse at 8 o'clock in the morning, took the elevator to his floor, and sat down at his desk. There was a new case file at the center of the blotter, thick, unopened, the kind of file that represents months of work ahead, and a result that is not yet certain. He picked up his pen, flipped open the cover, and began to read in the same quiet building, where justice had always been the work, and where the work was still waiting, and where he intended to do it. If this story moved, you consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the people who refuse to be invisible.